It's funny, looking back, how sometimes the biggest wake-up calls come dressed up as the most absurd things. I mean, who sends their husband a performance review? Not just any performance review, mind you, but one that's basically an ultimatum. And to make it even wilder, she sent it to me in the middle of a $2.8 million business meeting. My phone buzzed, a sharp little jolt against my thigh, right as I was mid-sentence, pitching a massive deal to 3 senior executives. This deal? It could have changed my entire career. I glanced down, discreetly, and there it is, a message from Sarah. The subject line alone made my stomach drop: husband performance evaluation, urgent, followed by a 5-page document attachment. Urgent. Right then. In that moment. My mind just screamed, "Are you kidding me?" But I couldn't look. I was locked in, deep in the flow of that presentation. So, I silenced my phone, tucked it away, and forced myself to keep going. The presentation, miraculously, went well. We shook hands, they promised an answer by Friday, and I walked out feeling like I'd just nailed something huge, a real win. And then I got into my car. And I opened that message. Everything just shifted. It was formatted like an actual HR review, complete with categories, scores out of 10, and detailed notes on my alleged failures as a husband. Financial contribution got a 6 out of 10. Apparently, I was meeting baseline expectations, but showing no growth initiative. Emotional availability scored a 4 because I worked too much. Romance? A measly 3, because I'd forgotten our 3-month wedding anniversary. And at the bottom, in bold, aggressive red text, she'd written, "You have 7 days to prove you're worth staying married to. Don't disappoint me again." I just sat there, staring at my phone, for what felt like an eternity. 10 minutes? 15? I wasn't angry, not yet. Mostly, I was just profoundly confused. When had my marriage become a job I could get fired from? To understand how I even got to that absurd moment, we have to rewind a bit. My name's Alex, I'm 32. I'm a regional sales manager for a mid-sized tech company in Portland, Oregon. I make decent money, around $140,000 a year, plus bonuses. I even own my house outright, bought it as a foreclosure years ago and spent 2 years fixing it up myself. I met Sarah about 10 months ago at my cousin's wedding. She was a bridesmaid. She was beautiful, charming, and we just clicked. She was 24, working as a marketing coordinator for some startup, and she seemed so ambitious and independent. We dated for 5 months, got engaged, and then, 3 months later, we were married. Honestly, everything felt fine, maybe even great, until about 3 weeks after the wedding. That's when she quit her job. She told me she wanted to focus on being a wife, on making our home perfect, on supporting my career so I could advance faster. At the time, it sounded sweet. Like she was truly invested in us as a team. I said, okay, figuring maybe she was just burned out and needed a break. But then the spending started. Before we got married, Sarah was pretty normal with money. She'd split checks, buy her own stuff, never expected me to cover everything. After the wedding, it was like a switch flipped. Suddenly, she was ordering $300 worth of skincare products, signing up for a boutique gym that cost $200 a month, getting her hair done every 3 weeks at some fancy salon downtown. I'm not cheap. I've never been cheap. But I started noticing that every single week, there was another charge on our joint account for something she needed. A few months in, I tried to bring it up gently. I asked if maybe we could budget a little better. She looked at me like I'd just insulted her entire existence. "I gave up my career for you," she said, her voice sharp. "The least you can do is make sure I'm taken care of." It felt incredibly manipulative, but I didn't have the energy to fight about it right then. So, I just let it go, telling myself we'd work it out eventually. That was then. This was now. This absolutely insane message in my car. I realized, with a sickening lurch, how many red flags I'd ignored, how desperately I'd wanted to believe I'd made the right choice marrying her. I drove home in silence, rehearsing different responses in my head, trying to figure out if I was overreacting or if this was genuinely as crazy as it felt. When I got there, Sarah was on the couch, watching some reality show. She looked up at me with this expectant smile, like she was waiting for me to apologize for existing, I guess. I didn't say anything at first. I just walked past her into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water. She followed me. "Did you get my message?" she asked, her tone annoyingly calm. "Yeah," I said, my voice flat. "I got it. Right in the middle of the most important meeting of my career." She didn't even flinch. "Good," she said, as if I'd just confirmed a delivery. "So, you understand? We need to have a serious conversation about our future." She sounded exactly like a manager calling an underperforming employee into her office. "Are you serious about this whole 7-day evaluation thing?" I asked, my blood starting to simmer. She nodded. "Completely serious, Alex. I've been unhappy for a while, and I need to see real change, or I don't think this is going to work." Her tone was so casual, like she was talking about returning a sweater that didn't fit right. I stood there, looking at her. Really looking at her. And I saw someone I didn't recognize anymore. This wasn't the woman I married. Or maybe it was, and I'd just been too distracted to notice. I took a deep breath and said something I'd been thinking about for weeks, but never had the courage to actually verbalize. "If you're evaluating me," I told her, my voice steady, "then I'm evaluating you, too. Consider this a mutual review period." Her face went blank for a second, like she hadn't expected me to push back at all. Then she let out a short, dismissive laugh. "Fine," she scoffed. "Evaluate away. I'm sure you'll realize pretty quickly that you're lucky to have me." She walked back to the couch and unpaused her show. I went upstairs to my office and closed the door. I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop, not really sure what I was doing yet, but knowing that something fundamental had just changed. I pulled up our joint bank account and started scrolling through the last few months of transactions. What I found made my blood run cold. We were talking thousands of dollars spent on things that had absolutely nothing to do with running a household. Clothes, fancy restaurants, subscriptions to services I'd never even heard of. And the kicker? Her contribution to any of this was exactly $0. She hadn't worked, hadn't brought in any income, and hadn't even really managed the house because we still ordered takeout 4 times a week, and I was the one who did most of the cleaning. I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. And for the first time in months, I felt something other than confusion. I felt clarity. If Sarah wanted to evaluate whether I was worth keeping, then I was going to evaluate whether this marriage was worth keeping. And I had a feeling I already knew what the answer was going to be. The next morning, day 2 of her evaluation, I woke up at 6, like I always do. Showered, got dressed for work. When I came downstairs, Sarah was still asleep in our bedroom with the door closed. This wasn't unusual, she rarely got up before 10:30. But today, it hit different. Because I was actively paying attention to what she actually did with her time. I made coffee, checked my emails, and before I left for the office, I did something I'd never done before. I took my laptop with me instead of leaving it on my desk at home. I also called my brother, Ben, and asked him if he could swing by the house later to pick up some tools I'd supposedly borrowed. Really, I was giving him a spare key and asking him to keep an eye on things, just in case. He agreed, without asking too many questions, because he's always been good like that. On my lunch break, from my office, I logged into our joint account and started building a spreadsheet. Every single transaction from the moment she quit her job, organized by category. It took me almost 2 hours, but by the end, I had a complete financial picture of our marriage, and it was worse than I'd imagined. Sarah had spent $9,200 in the 4 months since she quit working. That was clothes, beauty treatments, restaurants with her friends, subscription boxes, online shopping, boutique fitness classes, and about a dozen other things that had nothing to do with our household. Her contribution to our joint expenses, to groceries, utilities, the mortgage, anything that actually kept our life running, was $0. I sat there, staring at the numbers, feeling like an absolute idiot for not catching this sooner. But I was busy working and trying to build a future, and I trusted her to be reasonable. That trust was clearly misplaced. I created a new checking account in my name only and transferred most of my money into it, leaving just enough in the joint account to cover the bills I knew were coming due this month. Then I called my buddy Chris, who's a family lawyer, and asked if he had time for a drink after work. We met at a bar near his office around 7. I laid out the whole situation, the performance review, the spending, the entitlement, all of it. Chris listened without interrupting. When I was done, he was quiet for a minute. Then he said what I was describing sounded like financial manipulation. That someone who contributes nothing but demands everything and then threatens to leave if you don't meet their standards is controlling you. He told me I needed to document everything, take screenshots, save messages, keep records of all spending, because if this went where he thought it was going, I'd need proof. He also told me something I wasn't expecting, that Sarah had been talking about me to mutual friends for months. Complaining that I was cheap, that I didn't appreciate her, that she could have done better. Chris said he hadn't wanted to tell me before because he thought it was just normal marriage venting. But combined with everything else, it painted a pretty clear picture of someone who'd been checked out of the relationship for a while. I drove home feeling like I'd just been punched in the stomach. Not because I was heartbroken, but because I was angry at myself for missing all the signs. When I got there, Sarah was in the living room with her friend Chloe. They were drinking wine and watching something on Netflix, and they both looked up when I walked in. Chloe left pretty quickly, said she had to get home, and I could tell from the look on her face that they'd been talking about me. Once she was gone, I sat down across from Sarah and asked her directly if she'd been complaining about me to our friends. She got defensive immediately. Said I was being paranoid, that she was allowed to talk to her friends about her feelings. I told her that was fine, but maybe don't post about it on Instagram where 3,000 people can see it. Her face went pale. She asked what I was talking about. So, I pulled up my phone and showed her the screenshots I'd taken during my lunch break. She'd posted a story yesterday about being married to someone who doesn't understand that maintaining yourself costs money. And another one this morning about cheap men who expect their wives to look expensive on a Walmart budget. She tried to laugh it off, said she was just venting and didn't think I'd see it. But I pointed out that it was public, that anyone, including my coworkers and family, could see it, that she was humiliating me online while living off my income. She got quiet, and then said something that genuinely shocked me. Maybe if you made more money, she said, I wouldn't have to complain. I just stared at her. I make $140,000 a year. We have no debt except for a tiny mortgage. And she spent money like we were pulling in $500,000. The joint account, I told her, my voice low and firm, is going to be for household expenses only from now on. My paycheck will go into a separate account. If you need money for personal things, you can get a job, like every other adult. She lost it. Started yelling about how I was trying to control her, how I'd promised to take care of her, how this wasn't what she signed up for. I stayed calm. I didn't sign up to be an ATM with a wedding ring, I told her. Marriage is supposed to be a partnership. And right now, I'm the only one contributing anything. She stormed off to the bedroom and slammed the door. I spent the rest of the night in my office, going through more bank statements and screenshotting her social media posts. Day 3, I worked from home and watched what Sarah actually did all day. She woke up at 11, made herself breakfast, spent 2 hours on her phone, went to a yoga class, came home, showered, and then sat on the couch scrolling through shopping apps until I was done working. She didn't clean anything, didn't cook, didn't do laundry, didn't even take out the trash. When I asked her what she did today, she said she was busy and seemed genuinely offended that I was questioning her. That evening, I got a text from Chris. He'd heard from another friend that Sarah had been telling people she was keeping her options open, which was apparently code for she was already thinking about her next relationship before this one was even over. I didn't confront her about it yet, because I was still gathering information, still building my case. But internally, I'd already made my decision. On day 4, I met with the lawyer Chris recommended, a woman named Emily who specializes in divorce cases. I walked her through everything. She took notes, asked questions about assets and timelines, and told me that if we moved forward, I'd want to act fast, before Sarah figured out what was happening and started hiding things or making accusations. I left her office with a folder full of paperwork and a retainer agreement. On my drive home, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. I felt like I was back in control of my own life. When I walked through the door that night, Sarah was waiting for me with her arms crossed. I knew from her expression that she'd figured out something had changed. She just didn't know what yet. Day 5 started with me making phone calls from my office at work. The kind of calls you make when you're systematically removing someone from your life. First, I called our phone carrier and moved Sarah's line to a separate account under her name. She could keep the number, but she'd have to pay for it herself starting next month. Then, I called our car insurance company and removed her from my policy. She was listed as a driver on my car, but it's titled in my name only, so legally, I could do this. I updated all my beneficiary information on my life insurance and retirement accounts, changing everything from Sarah to my brother, Ben. And I sent an email to HR at work doing the same thing with my health insurance and 401k. The whole process took about 3 hours. By the time I was done, I felt lighter, like I'd been carrying something heavy and finally put it down. I left work early and drove straight to Emily's office, where I signed the divorce petition and wrote a check for her retainer. She told me the papers would be ready to serve by tomorrow and asked if I wanted to be there when it happened. I told her no. Just have the process server go to the house in the morning when I'm at work. That evening, I came home. Sarah was in the kitchen, making herself a smoothie. She asked me if I'd thought about her evaluation and what changes I was planning to make. I looked at her, standing there in her expensive workout clothes, with her fresh manicure, holding a $400 blender. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it all. I've thought about it a lot, I told her, and I'll have an answer for you tomorrow. She smiled, like she'd already won, and went back to her smoothie. Day 6. That's when everything fell apart for her. I went to work like normal, and around 10 in the morning, I got a text from my neighbor, Steve, with a photo attached. Steve's the retired guy 2 doors down who I helped with his fence last summer. The photo showed Sarah screaming at a process server on our front porch. Apparently, she didn't take the divorce papers well. My phone started blowing up with calls and texts from her, but I ignored all of them. I was in back-to-back meetings all day, and I genuinely didn't have time for her drama. Around 3 in the afternoon, Ben called. He told me I needed to come home, that Sarah's mother, Margaret, had shown up at the house, and they were both losing their minds. I told him I'd be there in 30 minutes, and I left work early for the second day in a row. When I pulled into my driveway, there was a car I didn't recognize parked on the street, and I could hear yelling from inside the house before I even opened the door. Sarah and her mother, Margaret, were both in the living room. Sarah was crying, and Margaret was pacing back and forth, talking on her phone. When I walked in, they both turned to look at me like I was the villain in their story. Margaret hung up and immediately started in on me about how I was ruining her daughter's life, how I was abandoning my responsibilities, how no real man would treat his wife this way. I let her finish. Then I very calmly told her that her daughter hadn't worked in 4 months, had spent more than $9,000 of my money on personal luxuries, publicly humiliated me on social media, and gave me a literal performance review like I was her employee. Margaret looked at Sarah for confirmation, and Sarah just stood there crying, not denying any of it. I told them both that I was done with this conversation and that they needed to leave. Margaret snapped that Sarah lived here and didn't have to go anywhere. So, I pulled out my phone and showed them the 30-day notice to vacate that Emily had drafted. Sarah had 30 days to find somewhere else to live. After that, I could pursue formal eviction if necessary. Margaret's face went red, and she started yelling again, calling me every name she could think of. Sarah just crumpled onto the couch, sobbing. I went upstairs to my office and locked the door. I could hear them downstairs for another hour before they finally left. Around 8 that night, my doorbell rang. When I looked through the window, I saw Sarah standing there with 2 of her friends. I opened the door, and before I could say anything, she pushed past me into the house. Her friends followed, and suddenly I had 3 women in my living room staging what I guess was supposed to be an intervention. Sarah was calmer now, she wasn't crying anymore. She told me she'd overreacted this morning, that she was shocked and hurt, but she was ready to talk rationally now. She said she knew she'd made mistakes, but so had I. That marriage was about compromise, that we could work through this if I just cancelled the divorce and gave her another chance. Her friends nodded along like this was a reasonable request, like the last 4 months hadn't happened. I stood there, listening to her talk, and I realized she still didn't get it. She still thought this was negotiable, that she could manipulate her way back into the life she had. When she finally stopped talking, I looked at her and said the only thing that needed to be said. You had 7 days, I told her, and you wasted all of them. Her face changed. The fake calm disappeared, and she started yelling again about how I never loved her, how I used her, how she gave up everything for me. I didn't argue, because there was no point. I just told her and her friends to leave, and that if they didn't, I'd call the police. They left, but not before Sarah told me I was going to regret this, that she'd take me for everything I had, that I'd end up alone and miserable. I closed the door behind them and changed all the locks that night. I'd ordered new hardware online 2 days ago, and it had arrived that morning. Day 7 was quiet. Sarah didn't come by, didn't call, didn't text. I went to work, came home, and spent the evening packing up her belongings into boxes that I'd have delivered to wherever she ended up. I found clothes with tags still on them, shoes she wore once, beauty products that cost more than my weekly grocery budget. Every box I packed felt like evidence of how blind I was, how I'd let someone take advantage of me because I wanted to believe I'd made the right choice. That night, I slept better than I had in months, because I knew it was finally over. I knew that I was getting my life back, and I knew that Sarah was about to learn a very expensive lesson about what happens when you mistake someone's patience for weakness. 6 months later, the divorce was finalized, and I was sitting in my living room with a cup of coffee, thinking about how different my life looked now. Sarah tried to fight for alimony, but her lawyer couldn't make a case when she'd only been unemployed for 4 months of our 8-month marriage and had no dependents. Last I heard from Chris, she's working retail at a mall in Clackamas, living with 2 roommates in a small apartment, and dealing with credit card debt from trying to maintain her lifestyle after I cut her off. I don't take any pleasure in her struggles, but I also don't feel guilty about them. She made her choices, and these are the consequences. As for me, I got that $2.8 million contract approved 3 weeks after the divorce was filed, which came with a promotion and a significant raise. I've been seeing someone new for about 2 months now, a veterinarian named Kate. She owns her own practice and insisted on splitting the bill on our first date. She's 30, financially independent. When I told her about Sarah, she said something that stuck with me. She said that anyone who makes you prove your worth doesn't understand what partnership means. I still think about that performance review sometimes. About how insulting and dehumanizing it was to have my value as a husband reduced to scores and metrics. But I also think about how it was the wake-up call I needed. Without that moment of clarity, I might have stayed in that marriage for years, slowly losing myself while Sarah drained my bank account and my self-respect. She wanted to evaluate my worth, and in doing so, she revealed her own, or rather, the complete absence of it. What would you have done if you received a performance review from your partner?